I need you to come outside. My cousin's voice on the other end of the phone had that particular flatness, the kind that isn't calm, it's rehearsed. There is a difference, and once you have heard it enough times, you stop confusing the two. I was standing in my kitchen with a spatula in my hand, eggs going in the pan, music on low the way I liked on a Monday morning when I did not have to be anywhere until noon. I looked out the window at the driveway I had spent 2 years of my life building toward. There was a moving truck parked at the end of it, a full-size moving truck, the kind you rent by the day, and behind it 2 cars I recognized, my aunt's blue sedan and my cousin's rusting silver hatchback, both of them nosed up to the curb like they were settling in. I had not invited anyone. I had not given out my address. And yet here they were, cardboard boxes visible through the truck's open rear. 5 people I shared blood with standing in the mild October air with the easy certainty of people who had already decided the answer was yes before they ever thought to ask the question. I turned off the burner. I set the spatula down. I went outside. That is where the story starts, at that driveway, on that morning. But the story does not make any sense from there. Not really, without going back further. The kind of thing that happened that Monday does not arrive without history. It is the last room in a house that has been under construction for years. And if I just walk you into the last room without showing you how the foundation was laid, then the story becomes about a moving truck. And it is not really about a moving truck. It is about something that took me much longer than I would like to admit to see clearly. And I want you to see it clearly, because I think there is a good chance that some part of it is familiar to you. I grew up in a large extended family. I am talking about the kind of large where there are enough cousins that you genuinely lose track at some of the birthday parties, where the holidays require a rotation between 3 or 4 houses because no single house can hold everyone, where news travels through a network of aunts and mothers and family group chats with a speed and accuracy that would make a newsroom jealous, except for the accuracy part, which is negotiable. My family is loud in the way that people sometimes mistake for warmth, and I made that mistake for a long time. Volume and warmth look similar from the inside. They feel similar too when you are young enough that you do not yet have a reference point for how quiet care can be. I was the first in my immediate family to finish a 4-year degree. I want to say that plainly, not because it is a point of pride in the way people sometimes use it, as a separator, as a credential, but because it is a fact that shaped everything about how my family saw me from that point forward. I became, in the family shorthand, the one who had figured it out, the one who was going somewhere. That framing arrived before I had done anything to justify it, and stayed well after it had calcified into an expectation. When I was 24 and working 2 jobs and eating a lot of pasta, and living in a 1-bedroom apartment that was aggressively not impressive, I was still the one who had figured it out. The idea of me had lapped the reality of me by about 3 years and was still pulling ahead. I worked in a field that rewarded patience. I cannot be more specific than that without making the story traceable, but I will say it is the kind of work where the first several years feel like you are shoveling something uphill, and then around year 5 or 6, if you have not quit, the ground starts to level. And then one day you look up and realize you are not shoveling anymore. I did not quit. I had debt to retire and habits to build, and a very clear image in my head. Not of anything dramatic, not of some mansion or lifestyle, just of a home. A specific, quiet, unremarkable home that was mine. A place where no one else held the key. I kept that image somewhere near the front of my mind for about 7 years, and I worked toward it with the consistency of someone who has decided that wanting something is not enough. You have to be boring about it, boring and consistent. Month after month, year after year, the savings account grew with the slowness of something that is actually real rather than promised. By the time I was 32, I had a down payment, and then I had a house. The house is not large. That point is relevant. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window that gets the morning light, a small yard that was overgrown when I bought it, and that I was in the process of slowly making less overgrown. The neighborhood is quiet in the particular way that neighborhoods 40 minutes outside of a city tend to be quiet. The kind of quiet that people who live in cities drive to on weekends and sigh at and then drive back from. I loved it immediately. Not the house especially, not the yard especially, but the specific quality of silence inside it that belonged to no one but me. I sat on the floor of the empty living room the day I got the keys and I cried. The good kind. The kind you only cry when something you have been holding onto for a very long time is finally actually real. I stayed on that floor for a while. I did not rush. There was nowhere to be. I had been careful about what I shared and with whom. I mentioned the purchase to the family at my cousin Marco's birthday dinner, because the news would have come out anyway, and I preferred to deliver it myself rather than let it surface through the network. I accepted the congratulations with the genuinely warm gratitude I felt, because I was proud of what I had done and I was not pretending otherwise. I smiled at the right moments. I said, yes, it was exciting. Yes, I was pleased. Yes, it felt like a long time coming. People hugged me. My mother touched my face. My Uncle Ray shook my hand with both of his, in the way he does at significant occasions. What I did not do was share the address. I told myself this was practical. The place needed work before anyone visited. There were boxes everywhere. It wasn't ready for company. This was true as far as it went. But the honest answer, the one I was not quite ready to say out loud in a room full of people who loved me in their particular way, is that I had learned what happened to information in my family, and I was not ready to donate the address to a pool I did not control. I had earned that house one careful, boring, consistent month at a time. I had never asked anyone for anything while I was building toward it. I was going to decide, slowly and deliberately, who got to be part of what came next. Information in my family has a particular way of becoming infrastructure. A detail shared in passing becomes a fixture. An invitation extended once becomes a standing arrangement. I had watched it happen to other people. To my cousin Priya, who had mentioned offhand that she had a fold-out couch and ended up with her sister living in her apartment for 7 months. To my Uncle Ray, who had loaned his truck one weekend and found it had silently become the family truck, available upon request. I had watched the mechanism work and I had cataloged it, and I had decided privately that I was going to be thoughtful about what I offered and when. I was not going to be cold. I was going to be considered. What I had not considered was that my Aunt Paulette had a relationship with public records that I had underestimated. The county recorder's office is, in fact, public. Property transactions are, in fact, searchable. My aunt had, in fact, no hesitation about using this information. I found this out much later, weeks after that Monday morning, when the dust had settled enough for the mechanics of it to become clear. At the time, standing in my kitchen looking at the truck, all I knew was that my cousin Dara was standing at the end of my driveway and had used a key she had not been given to arrive at an address she had not been offered. I went outside. There were 5 of them. Dara, she is 31, 3 years younger than me, and we had been close once in the way that cousins who grow up in the same orbit can be close. And her 2 kids, Tyler, who was 9, and Kaya, who was 11. My Aunt Paulette. and a man named Gerald, who was apparently Paulette's current partner and whom I had met twice, once at a funeral and once at a barbecue, and both times briefly. Gerald was standing near the truck with his arms crossed, not helping and not helping, occupying that specific posture of the person who is present at someone else's situation and has decided to observe it. The kids were running a stick along the edge of my fence. Dara had a box in her hands. She was already walking toward my front door. "We figured we'd stay a few weeks," she said, "just until things settle." I did not move from the porch steps. I looked at the box. I looked at the truck. I looked at Paulette, who met my eyes with the careful steadiness of someone who has been waiting for this moment and has prepared for several versions of it. I said, very quietly, "What things?" She told me. Dara's landlord had decided not to renew her lease. The building was going condo, the timeline was compressed, and somewhere in the compression, Dara had run out of runway. She had 60 days, which became 30, which became, as of this particular Monday morning in October, 0. Her kids would need to change schools. She was behind on some things she wasn't ready to itemize. She said all of this with the delivery of someone reciting something they have practiced, which is not the same thing as someone who is lying. The situation was real. I understood that immediately, and the difficulty of it was real too. I had no doubt about any of that. What I had a doubt about was the 2 months. "When did you find out your lease wasn't being renewed?" I asked. Dara looked at me. A small hesitation. "A couple months ago," she said. There it was. She had known for 2 months. She had not sent a single text, had not made a single call, had not sent one message through the family network that I apparently was not too far outside of, because Paulette had found my address. She had known for 60 days, and the first communication I received about any of this was a phone call telling me to come outside, with a moving truck already in my driveway. I stood on those steps and I took a breath that I was careful not to let show. I told them I needed a few minutes. I went back inside, walked to the kitchen, picked up the spatula, put it back down. The eggs were cold and rubbery in the pan. Through the window, I could see Tyler still running the stick along the fence. Kaya had found something in the yard and was showing it to Gerald, who was looking at it with the polite interest of a man who did not want to be here either. Dara was setting her box down on my porch. Paulette had not moved. I will tell you what I was feeling, because I think it is important to be honest about this. I was not, at that exact moment, angry. I was something that takes a minute to name, something closer to a recognition, a very clear and unsentimental understanding of exactly what was happening and what it meant. The anger came later, briefly, and then passed. What stayed was the recognition. I had been here before, not in this specific situation, not with a moving truck in my driveway, but in the shape of the situation, the logic of it. The logic that said you have things and people you love need things, and the distance between those two facts is a problem that you should be the solution to. I had been the solution to that logic before. I had said yes to small requests that became large arrangements. I had been understanding in ways that trained people to expect understanding. I had told myself that this was generosity when a more honest word might have been compliance. Standing in my kitchen looking at those cold eggs, I understood that I had arrived at a moment I could not soft pedal my way out of. I had a choice. I could let 5 people I had not invited move into the house I had spent 7 years building toward, or I could not. Those were the actual choices, and I was done pretending there were others. I went back outside. "I'm not going to be able to have you stay here," I said. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The silence of people encountering a wall where they expected a door. Dara looked at me. Paulette looked at me. Gerald looked at the truck. Tyler and Kaya were unaware, still in their own world at the edge of the yard, which I was grateful for. Dara started with practical reason. She went through the situation again, more detail this time, the specifics of the landlord and the timeline and the schools and what the options looked like from where she was standing. She was not dramatic about it. She was actually quite composed, which made it harder in some ways and easier in others. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I did not look away. I let her finish. When she was done, I said that I understood everything she had just told me, and I meant it, and my answer was the same. Then she moved to history. She reminded me, and I want to be clear, that I had not forgotten, that 8 years ago, when a pipe burst in my apartment and I had 3 days to find somewhere to go, she had let me sleep on her couch. This is true. It happened. I was grateful then, and I am grateful now. I told her so. I also reminded her, gently, that I had stayed 2 weeks and paid for my share of groceries and helped clean her bathroom twice. She did not dispute this. I said that I would always remember what she did for me, and that it did not change what I was telling her now. And the reason it did not change anything was that what had happened 8 years ago and what was happening today were not the same exchange. What happened 8 years ago was something I asked for and she gave. What was happening today was something that had been assumed, arranged without me, in my name, using my address, with a moving truck. Paulette stepped forward. I had been waiting for Paulette. She asked me if I understood what family meant. She said it with the weight of someone delivering a verdict, rather than asking a genuine question. I took a beat before I answered, because I wanted the answer to be exact. I said that I did understand what family meant. I said I had understood it my whole life, that I had grown up inside this family, that I had shown up for the people in it in ways both large and small, that I had been the cousin who drove 3 hours to help with the move, who had lent money I was not sure I would see again, who had sat in waiting rooms and held hands and answered the phone at 2 a.m. I said all of this not to argue my credentials, but because the suggestion that I did not understand family felt like the one thing I could not let stand unchallenged. Then I said, understanding what family means does not require pretending that a question was asked when it wasn't. She said that this was different. She said this was an emergency. I said that emergencies still came with phone calls, that 2 months was enough time for a phone call, that 60 days was enough time for a text, that if you knew for 2 months that you needed help and the person you were planning to ask for help did not receive a single communication from you until there was a moving truck in their driveway, that was not an emergency. That was a decision about what you expected and what you felt entitled to, and those were things we could talk about honestly. But I was not going to pretend the truck was a natural disaster. The thing that happens when you name the mechanism, when you say out loud the thing that everyone is pretending isn't happening, is that the pretending becomes harder to maintain. Not impossible, but harder. Paulette's expression shifted in a way I had rarely seen it shift. Something like recalibration, an adjustment of the internal framing that had brought her to my driveway with such confidence. She said, after a moment that felt longer than it was, that they had assumed, that they had thought I would want to help, that they had not imagined I would say no. I said that I knew. That was the whole thing, actually. I knew. That was precisely the problem I was naming. She tried a different angle. She said that she had heard I had 2 bedrooms and that one of them was empty. She said this as though it were a piece of evidence, a clinching detail, as though the existence of an empty room in my house was a standing offer she had been right to accept on my behalf. I looked at her for a moment and I thought, there it is. The logic, stated plainly. You have space, therefore the space is available. You have resources, therefore the resources belong to the need that has appeared in front of them. The architecture of assumption, laid out in one sentence about a bedroom. I said, the room is empty because I chose not to put anything in it yet. That's not an invitation. I said that I knew. Dara picked up her box from the porch and set it back down on the driveway. Just that. Set it down, not a dramatic gesture. Just setting something down because she needed her hands free. Tyler was asking Kaya something. I could hear their voices, but not the words. A car went past on the street. I stood on the steps and I felt, underneath everything, entirely clear. Not cold. I want to emphasize that because what I am describing is not coldness. It is a different thing. Something that has warmth in it, but also a spine. I felt like myself. I felt like someone standing in their own driveway in front of their own house, making a decision that was theirs to make. Paulette made a few more attempts. She mentioned my grandmother, which is the move that gets deployed when other arguments have stalled. Invoking someone whose name carries enough love and weight to restructure the moral landscape of a conversation. My grandmother is 81 and sharp, and has, I would later learn, opinions about that Monday morning that do not align with the ones being expressed on my driveway. I said that I loved my grandmother, and she had nothing to do with Dara's lease. Dara said, "So you're really doing this?" I said, "I'm not doing anything. You came here without asking. I'm asking you to make a different plan, and I want to help you make one." That last part, the offer, was the part I had been building toward, because I had not been standing in my kitchen for 15 minutes, just taking deep breaths. I had been thinking. I had already, in outline, begun identifying real options. Not abstract comfort, not vague reassurance, but specific, practical, actual places where 5 people could go. I went back inside. I told them I was going to make some calls and I asked them to wait. What followed was about 2 hours during which I sat at my kitchen table with my phone and made a series of calls that I had not planned to make on that particular Monday, but that I was going to make anyway. I called my mother's friend Josephine, who manages a small apartment building about 20 minutes east of where Dara's kids went to school. Josephine's building is modest, her rates are reasonable, and she had mentioned twice in recent months that she had a vacancy she hadn't filled because she was waiting for the right tenant. I explained the situation to Josephine, leaving out the moving truck in my driveway, focusing on Dara's circumstances, and asked if she would be willing to show the unit. Josephine said yes and gave me the address and said she could do it tomorrow. I called a woman named Sister Patricia from the congregation I had grown up in, who had told our whole community not 3 months earlier that her basement was available to families in transition and that the offer was sincere. I had remembered this specifically because of the way she had said it, not as a general expression of goodwill, but as an invitation with a phone number attached. Sister Patricia's basement was not glamorous, but it was clean. It was free for the first month, and it was a 10-minute drive from Dara's kids' school. Sister Patricia said she had been waiting for someone to call. I found a motel 2 miles from the school that offered weekly rates at a price that was tight but manageable, and confirmed the address and the rate with the front desk. Then I transferred money. Not a small amount, not a symbolic amount, enough to cover the first week at the motel, or the first month's deposit at Josephine's building, or the first 2 weeks of groceries while things got sorted. I did not calculate whether I could afford it in the way I might on an ordinary day. I could, and I did it, because the choice I was making was not about withholding. It was about the terms of the offer. I wanted to be sure those terms were clear. I wrote it all down on a piece of paper. The 3 options, the addresses, the names and phone numbers, the amount I had transferred, and what it could cover. I made it as specific as I could because I wanted there to be no confusion about what I was actually offering. Then I folded the paper once and I went back outside. Dara read it. She did not read it fast. She stood in my driveway and read every word, and I watched her face do things that I did not try to interpret. My aunt had moved back toward her car. Gerald had, at some point, gotten into the passenger seat. The kids were in the truck's cab now, visible through the windshield, looking at something on a phone. When Dara finished reading, she folded the paper the way I had folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at me for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. She did not say thank you. I had not expected her to, and I was not hurt by it. What she said quietly was, "You really thought this was better." I said, "I thought you deserved better than sleeping in someone's house who wasn't expecting you. Yes." She nodded once, with the quality of someone absorbing something they are not quite ready to agree with, but cannot entirely argue against. Then she got in her car. Paulette got in her car. Gerald was already in his. The moving truck pulled out first, made a U-turn at the end of the block, and was gone. By the time the sun had moved out of the kitchen window and into the living room, my driveway was empty. I went inside. I reheated the eggs. They were not good. They had long since passed the point of salvage, but I tried anyway and ate about half of them while standing at the counter. Then I sat at the table and stared at the wall for a while, and eventually I put on music again, something without words, and started unpacking a box of books that had been sitting in the corner of the living room since I moved in. I will tell you about the aftermath because pretending there was none would be dishonest. The calls started that evening. My aunt to my mother to me. My mother's voice carrying that careful, neutral tone of someone who has heard one version of events and is waiting diplomatically for the other. 2 cousins who had not been present sent messages that were short on detail and long on feeling. The family group chat, 47 people, accumulated over years of additions and the occasional departure, when active with the energy of people who have sensed conflict and cannot help but orbit it. The version of events that circulated was compressed in the way second-hand accounts always are. In the version that traveled through the network, Dara and her children had shown up and been turned away from my door. The moving truck was mentioned. My house with its empty rooms was mentioned. The 2 months of silence on Dara's part were not mentioned. The note was not mentioned. The money was not mentioned. The phone numbers I had spent an afternoon sourcing were not mentioned. What circulated consistently was the image of a cousin with 2 children standing at a relative's door and being told no. My Uncle Darren sent a voice note, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The word selfish appeared twice, and the phrase your grandmother would be ashamed of you appeared once. I let all of it sit for 3 days. Not because I was afraid of it. I was not afraid of it. Because I wanted to be sure of the words I chose before I chose them. I have learned across enough difficult conversations that the urge to respond immediately is almost never wisdom and almost always adrenaline. And the 2 feel identical in the moment and very different in the aftermath. On the 4th day, I wrote a message to the group thread. All 47 people. I drafted it 3 times. The first draft was too long and had too much feeling in it, the kind of feeling that reads as defensive even when the defense is accurate. The second draft was too terse, a list of facts with no connective tissue, the kind of thing that would feel like a courtroom brief to people who were already primed to be hurt. The third draft was what I sent, a sequence of events, stated plainly, in order, with dates where I had them. I laid out what had happened from the beginning, from the phone call, to the truck, to the conversation on the porch. I stated the date Dara had learned about her lease. The timeline mattered enormously, and I needed it on record. I stated that no call, no text, no message of any kind had reached me before the truck arrived. I described what I had offered, the 3 options, the names, the phone numbers. I included the exact amount of money I had transferred, because I wanted that number to exist in the record, visible and plain, where it could not be summarized away in someone's retelling or quietly forgotten. I ended without asking for anything. No validation requested, no apology demanded, no acknowledgement required. Just, this is what happened in this order, and here are the specifics. I pressed send and I put my phone face down on the table, and I went and made tea. 11 people left the group chat. One by one, over about 40 minutes, which I watched with a strange detachment. The member count ticking down in the corner like a clock running backward. 4 people responded to say they had not known the full story. One person I did not expect sent a single emoji, a quiet, private signal of solidarity that I appreciated more than anything that required more words. My Uncle Darren sent nothing. My Aunt Paulette sent nothing. My grandmother called me 2 days later from her landline. She is the last person in my family who still has one, and she uses it with the confidence of someone who never saw the need to change. She is 81. She has been in this family for all of it, every decade of the dynamics I have been describing, every version of the arrangement where the person who had something was expected to be the solution to someone else's need. She called and she said directly, "You did the right thing. Don't let them make you doubt it." Then she asked whether I had been eating properly. I said yes. She said good. Then she asked about the house, and I described it to her. The kitchen window and the morning light, the overgrown yard, the curtains I kept meaning to hang. And she listened the way she has always listened, like she was genuinely interested rather than waiting for her turn to speak. We talked for 40 minutes. I did not want to hang up. Dara took Josephine's apartment. I found this out 6 weeks later through a third party, a cousin unentangled from any of what had happened, who mentioned it the way you mention something factual, without editorial. The kids enrolled in a school nearby. I do not know how that transition went for them, whether the new school was kind or unkind, whether Tyler still ran sticks along fences, or whether Kaya had found a subject she loved. I hope those things. I did not ask. 4 weeks after that, I transferred a second, smaller amount of money to Dara's account with no message attached. Just the number, just the transfer, arriving in her account the way rain arrives, without explanation. She did not respond. I did not need her to. The money was not an attempt to reopen a conversation. It was something I chose to do, freely, on my own terms, which is the only way anything I give has ever felt like giving, rather than the other thing. My Aunt Paulette and I did not speak for 4 months. The silence was not comfortable, but it was not the kind of uncomfortable that needed emergency repair. It was the silence of a situation that needed time before it could be assessed without heat. When we finally found ourselves at the same birthday dinner for my younger cousin, we sat at the same table. We were civil. She said she had thought I was being stubborn. I said I had thought I was being clear. We did not resolve anything. We ate the same food. We said goodbye in the parking lot with an embrace that felt more like a truce than a reunion. And I drove home in the dark feeling, not happy exactly, but something durable, something that did not require maintenance. I want to tell you about the house, about what it became after all of that, because that is the part of the story I most want to have landed. Not the confrontation, not the aftermath, but the after, the place where the lesson actually lives. I finished unpacking. It took longer than I expected, not because there was so much to unpack, but because I kept stopping to decide where things should actually go. Not just where they fit, but where I wanted them, which turned out to be a genuinely different question and one I had not had occasion to ask in any of the places I had lived before. Every previous apartment had been a temporary arrangement, and I had furnished and organized all of them with the implicit acknowledgement that this was not the place. This was not the version of my life that counted yet. Now it counted. Now everything I put somewhere was going where I put it with intention, and the difference in how that felt was greater than I had anticipated. I hung the curtains. They were a particular off-white linen that I had ordered twice. The first order was wrong, the color slightly more yellow than it appeared on the screen, and I returned them and waited 3 weeks for the second pair. And when the second pair arrived and I hung them in the living room in the early afternoon light, I stood back and looked at them for a long time because they were exactly right. That is a small thing. It is also not a small thing, if you understand what I mean. I painted the bathroom. I spent 3 weeks looking at swatches taped to the wall at different heights and in different lights before I committed. A deep blue-gray that reads differently in the morning, when the window lets in cool light, than it does in the evening, when the overhead fixture warms it toward something almost green. I have never once regretted it. There is something about choosing a color like that, taking a risk on something you cannot fully preview, committing to it, and having it be right. That feels like a small rehearsal for other kinds of commitment. I tackled the yard in pieces, a few hours at a time on weekend mornings, before the heat of the day arrived. By March, it had stopped being embarrassing. By May, it was starting to be something. In late May, I planted herbs, basil, thyme, a small rosemary bush that the internet assured me was difficult to kill, and that so far has lived up to the description. And then, because I had apparently developed opinions about gardening without noticing, I planted one tomato plant. A single plant because I was trying to be realistic about my own attention span and the limits of my experience. For most of June, the plant looked like an argument against optimism. It sat there in the ground with the energy of something that had given up but hadn't gotten around to dying. Then in July, it started actually producing something. Small, uncertain flowers, then one fruit, then two, then three. By September, I had 3 tomatoes. I ate them with salt, standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the yard, and I was more proud of those 3 tomatoes than I had any logical right to be. 3 tomatoes from one plant that spent most of June looking defeated. The achievement of it was real. I had people over. Not many, and not often, and not immediately. But eventually, deliberately, I started bringing people into the space. The right people. The ones who sent a text first, who brought something when they said they would, who asked questions they actually wanted the answers to, who read the natural end of an evening and moved toward the door without needing to be pointed at it. I learned something from these evenings that I would not have been able to articulate before I lived it. I had spent years believing that the more people you included, the more generous you were, that an open door was a measure of character, that the ability to absorb other people's needs was the thing that made you good. What I had not understood was the difference between an open door you choose and an open door you have been trained to never close. The former is generosity. The latter is something else, and it wears the same face so successfully that it took me years of exhaustion to start telling them apart. The people who came to my house that first year left me feeling better than I had before they arrived. That had not always been true of company in my life before that house. I had not realized how much energy I had been spending on relationships that moved in only one direction until I was in the ones that did not, and I could feel the contrast. It is not that the previous relationships were without value. It is that their costs had been invisible to me, filed under the category of love and community, and what you do for people. And once I had something to compare them to, the invisibility became impossible. I want to say something about what I understand differently now. Not as a lesson. I am suspicious of people who end their stories with lessons, the way I am suspicious of people who are always certain about things, but as something closer to an observation, an honest report from the other side of that Monday. I had believed for most of my adult life that generosity was measured by its cost, that the more a gift stretched you, the more it inconvenienced you, the more it required you to step back from your own needs, the more it hurt, almost, the more real and meaningful the gift was. Sacrifice as the metric of love. I had been raised on this idea, breathed it in, and I had spent a significant portion of my adult life acting on it in ways that left me exhausted and quietly resentful without understanding why. Because I was doing the right thing, wasn't I? I was being generous, wasn't I? The arithmetic didn't work, and I kept running it. Here is what I think is actually true. Generosity that costs more than you can afford is not generosity. It is something else. Extraction sometimes, dependency sometimes, a mutual arrangement that neither party has ever agreed to examine out loud. And sometimes the person doing the extracting is not aware of it, has simply learned that a particular approach produces a particular outcome, and has never been given reason to examine the mechanism. I am not saying this to be charitable about what happened on my driveway. I am saying it because it is accurate, and because I was not a passive bystander in the system that produced that driveway. I had helped build it. One accommodating response at a time, one yes when I meant something more complicated. I had helped train the people around me to expect that the gap between their need and my resources was a problem I would absorb. The Monday in October was the last day of that training. What I did was not cruelty. I need to say that plainly because I think people standing at the edge of a similar situation sometimes need to hear it named. I did not leave anyone without options. I spent an afternoon making real calls and finding real places. I gave money, real money, enough to matter. I did all of that not as a performance of generosity to prove I was not a bad person, but because I genuinely cared about my cousin and her children, and I wanted them to be okay. The thing I did not give was access to my home and my life without my consent. That is not care. That is something different. And I had spent too many years allowing the two things to be treated as equivalent. There is a version of that Monday in which I step back from the porch steps. I carry boxes. I set up the air mattress in what I had been thinking of as my office, the room I was going to finally have, the room that was going to hold my desk and my books, and the particular silence of a person who works from home and needs somewhere to go inside their own house. I tell myself it is temporary with the soft knowledge, somewhere I cannot quite get to. That temporary is a word with extremely elastic properties in my family. That the word had described my cousin Priya's fold-out couch for 7 months. That it had described my Uncle Ray's truck for 3 years before he finally stopped responding to the requests. I cook for 7. I stopped having mornings like the one I was having before the phone rang. Music on low, the eggs in the pan, nowhere to be until noon, because that kind of morning requires a solitude that is no longer available to you in your own home when your home is no longer quite your own home. I stopped sitting in my kitchen for no particular reason. I stopped leaving the bathroom door open. I stopped moving through my own space like a person who belongs there, because the specific ease of belonging somewhere is contingent on being able to feel that it is yours. And when 5 people you did not invite are living inside it, the yourness becomes negotiable. I call it love. I call it family. I call it what you do for people, because those are the words that have always been available for it. And I do not yet have the other words. And slowly, over weeks and months that blur together, I become a little more hollow than I was. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be visible at a family birthday dinner, but steadily, the way things hollow when they are asked to give more than they contain. I know that version. I know it in the way you know the shape of a room you have lived in long enough that you could navigate it with your eyes closed. Not because I stayed in it on that particular Monday, but because I had stayed in smaller versions of it before. Smaller, less dramatic, easier to rationalize. Every time I had absorbed a request I did not want to absorb, because refusing felt like failing a test of love. Every time I had said, of course, when what I meant was something more complicated, something that started with I love you and ended with, but I also have limits, and I don't know how to say that to you without it sounding like a rejection. Every time I had let someone else's confidence about what I would do become more real in the room than my own quiet knowledge of what I actually wanted. The Monday in October was not my first moment of clarity. It was just the loudest one, the one that came with a moving truck and nowhere to hide the ambiguity. I chose my house. I chose the silent living room and the kitchen window and the cold eggs and the curtains I still had to hang. I chose the right to be surprised by my own Monday morning without having to share that surprise with 5 people I hadn't expected. I chose, in a way that I had never quite managed to choose before, myself. Not at the expense of the people I loved, but without apology to them for the act of choosing. The truck drove away. The driveway went quiet. The curtains went up. The tomatoes came in September. I know what I earned. I know what it cost to earn it. And I know what it cost me to keep it. And I know what keeping it has made possible. The kind of evenings that restore rather than deplete. The kind of mornings that are mine. The kind of love I can offer freely because it comes from a place that has not been emptied by extraction. I am not a person who does not help people. I am a person who finally understood the difference between offering and being used, and who stopped calling the second one by the first one's name. That is what I kept. That is what I worked for. That is enough.